There is a number the Kaelthi Compact likes to quote at diplomatic functions, a number engraved into the base of their Unity monument on Thren's Reach. 412. That is how many species have joined the Compact since its founding, each one vetted, each one measured against a single unbending criterion. Could they be trusted with the stars? 412 species had passed the measurement. Humanity would become the 413th, or it would become a cautionary tale told to younglings about ambition without wisdom. The Compact did not know yet which one it would be, neither in truth did humanity. But there is something the older species of the galaxy always forget when they build their tests, something buried so deep in their own comfortable histories that it never occurs to them to account for it. They forget what it cost to build a civilization out of nothing but dirt and desperation. Humanity had not forgotten. Humanity had never been permitted to forget. The testing station orbited a dead star at the edge of neutral space, a wheel of black alloy 2 kilometers across, ancient beyond any human structure, older than agriculture, older than the first fires lit in the caves of a species who had not yet looked up, and wondered what the lights in the sky truly were. The Compact called it the Crucible. It had judged 412 species before humanity's turn came, and it had turned away nearly 600 more quietly without ceremony, sending them back to their homeworlds to wait another 1,000 years before they were permitted to try again. The test was not violence. The Compact had learned long before humanity crawled out of its own oceans that violence measured nothing but cruelty. Instead, the Crucible measured what its architects called integrity under scarcity. It gave a species exactly enough to survive, and then it took something away and it watched what the species chose to do with the shortfall. For humanity's trial, the Compact selected 300 colonists, drawn by lottery from every continent and every walk of life, engineers and farmers, teachers and soldiers, a linguist from Lagos, a fisherman from the Faroe Islands, a woman who had spent 30 years repairing water systems in villages that no map remembered. They were given a habitat dome on a moon within the Crucible's reach, an atmosphere processor, sealed rations calculated to the calorie for a standard cycle of 200 days, and nothing else. No weapons, no contact with Earth, no promise of rescue if they failed. The Compact observers watched from orbit, recording everything, waiting to see what kind of civilization would rise or crumble inside that dome. On the 9th day, the atmosphere processor failed. It was not sabotage. The Compact's own engineers had confirmed that afterward, in reports humanity would not see for years. It was simple, unglamorous entropy, a valve seal never designed for the mineral composition of that particular moon's dust, corroding faster than any of the Compact's models had predicted. Within 6 hours, the processor's output had dropped to 60% of the colony's requirement. Within 12 hours, it had dropped to 40%. The observers up in orbit adjusted their instruments and settled in, because this was, after all, exactly the kind of shortfall the Crucible was built to create. They expected panic. They expected hoarding, or a scramble for whatever authority could seize control of the remaining air, or the quiet, brutal math of triage that so many species before humanity had performed, sorting the colonists into those worth saving and those who could be permitted to suffocate first. That is not what they got. The linguist from Lagos, whose name was Ade Okonkwo, had spent 4 years before the mission working with disaster relief teams in flooded river deltas, learning that the first hour of any crisis belonged not to solutions but to structure. He stood on an overturned supply crate in the center of the dome and did not ask anyone to be calm. He asked them to be useful. Within 20 minutes there were 3 teams, one stripping the processor down to its bones under the guidance of 2 engineers who had, in another life, kept century-old subway systems running in cities that could not afford new ones. One rationing the remaining breathable reserves with the same brutal, practiced efficiency the fisherman from the Faroes had once used to portion out food during a winter storm that had trapped his boat for 11 days. And one simply keeping the youngest and the frightened calm, because someone among 300 strangers had understood correctly that fear burned oxygen faster than exertion did. The Compact observers watching from orbit made a note in their logs that would later become famous among xenoanthropologists across a dozen species. Unexpected coordination speed, cause unknown, recommend further study. What they did not yet understand was that they were not watching an unusual burst of cooperation. They were watching the ordinary operating procedure of a species that had spent its entire history solving problems with less than it needed. Every human civilization that had ever mattered had been built this way, in flood, in famine, in siege, in the slow grinding scarcity of resources that never quite stretched far enough. The compact species had built their societies in eras of relative abundance, guided by benevolent institutions that smoothed the sharp edges off catastrophe before they could cut anyone. Humanity had never had that luxury. Humanity had built its entire civilization out of the sharp edges themselves. By day 11, the engineers had rebuilt the failed valve using a printer never designed for the task, cannibalizing parts from two of the dome's exterior sensor arrays, effectively blinding the colony's own instruments to the outside world in exchange for breathable air. It was not an elegant solution. The compact's own engineers, reviewing the schematics afterward, called it reckless, inefficient, structurally unsound by any standard their own culture would have accepted. It also worked. Atmosphere output climbed back to 80% by day 12 and stabilized at 90 by day 15, and it held there imperfect and patched and ugly for the remainder of the trial. The compact assumed the crisis was over. It was not designed to test what came next. On day 40, a second lottery-selected group arrived, unannounced, dropped without warning onto the far side of the moon by a compact shuttle that had not been part of the original trial parameters. 200 more colonists, chosen this time not from Earth's general population but specifically from among its refugees, people already displaced once by war or disaster before the compact had ever taken an interest in their species, now displaced a second time into a hostile testing ground with no resources of their own. The compact called this Phase 2, an assessment of what a struggling civilization does when asked to absorb another burden it did not choose and cannot refuse. This was historically where civilizations broke. The compact's own archives held 412 case studies confirming it. A society under strain, however cooperative, however well organized, reliably turned inward when a second group of strangers appeared demanding a share of resources already stretched thin. Xenophobia was not a uniquely human failing. The compact had documented it in feathered diplomats and silicon-based hive minds and slow, patient tree analogs that took a decade to reach any decision at all. Scarcity bred suspicion in every form of intelligence the galaxy had yet produced. It was in fact the single most consistent finding across every species ever tested. The 412 who joined the compact were not the species who never turned inward. They were simply the species who turned inward less catastrophically than the rest. Ade Okonkwo, by then unofficially and without any vote or ceremony, the closest thing the dome had to a coordinator, walked to the boundary between the original colony and the new arrivals within 4 hours of their landing. He did not bring guards. He did not bring a negotiating position. He brought water, rationed carefully from a supply that was already insufficient for the people who currently held it, and he handed the first canteen to a woman he had never met, a former teacher from a city that no longer existed on any map humanity still used, and he asked her name. It was not generosity without cost. The compact's instruments confirmed that within 6 hours, average caloric intake across the entire combined population had dropped by nearly 30%, redistributed to accommodate the new arrivals. 2 elderly colonists from the original group developed symptoms of malnutrition-related illness within the first week. The engineers who had rebuilt the atmosphere processor now faced the same problem at nearly double the population load, with no additional materials to draw from. By every metric the compact's own models tracked, the colony should have fractured. Resource-sharing algorithms across 412 prior trials predicted, with better than 90% confidence, that a population under this specific combination of pressures would form defensive enclaves within 72 hours. It took the humans 9 hours to fully integrate the two populations into a single set of work rosters. Not out of some naive, uncomplicated goodness the compact could easily categorize and dismiss. There were arguments. There was real anger, real grief, real fear voiced loudly and without apology, because humans had never pretended that hardship should be endured in silence. But the arguments happened over shared meals rather than across a dividing line, and the anger got resolved by people who had, every one of them, buried someone or lost something or gone hungry long before any compact station had ever taken an interest in their species. They recognized the shape of the crisis. They had all lived some version of it before. The observers up in orbit began, for the first time in the recorded history of the Crucible, to argue amongst themselves. There was a faction among the compact assessors, old and cautious, who insisted this was simply an anomaly, a statistical outlier that would resolve itself under sufficient additional pressure, and they petitioned to escalate the trial further, to introduce a resource failure severe enough to finally force the fracture their models predicted. There was another faction, smaller and newer to their positions, who argued that 412 prior trials had never accounted for a species whose baseline experience of existence was scarcity itself, and that continuing to escalate was not measuring humanity's integrity, but rather measuring how much suffering it would take to break something that had never, in its entire recorded history, been permitted to exist any other way. The debate lasted 3 full days of compact deliberation. In the end, it was not philosophy that decided it. It was a single junior observer, young by compact standards, who had been assigned to monitor the dome's internal communications and who played back, unprompted in the middle of the assessor's argument, a recording from day 41. It was Ade Okonkwo, exhausted, his voice rough from 30 hours without proper sleep, speaking not to the compact, who he did not know was listening in that moment, but to the teacher from the vanished city, the one he had handed the first canteen to. She had asked him why he had done it, why he had given away water his own people needed, to strangers who had simply been dropped on his doorstep with no warning and no choice in the matter. And he had said in a voice too tired for performance, too tired for anything but the plain truth, that he had grown up in a place where the taps ran dry for weeks at a time, where every family learned the exact weight of a liter of water and the exact cost of pretending you had more to share than you did, and that he had learned, long before any star map ever reached his hands, that the people who survived scarcity were never the ones who hoarded hardest. They were the ones who understood bone deep that hoarding only delayed the reckoning. Sharing was not sacrifice, sharing was arithmetic. A species that starved together and rebuilt together was harder to break than a species that starved alone. The recording ended. The compact assessors sat in a silence that, for a species that measured time in different increments than humanity did, still felt long. It was not a philosophical argument that moved them. It was the simple, unornamented fact that a tired man on a dying moon had, without knowing anyone of consequence was listening, described the entire operating logic of his civilization in 4 sentences, and that logic had already been proven in real time under conditions the compact itself had engineered to break it. The trial was called on day 118, 82 days ahead of its scheduled conclusion. It was the first time in the Crucible's recorded history that a trial had ended early for any reason other than catastrophic failure. The compact's formal ruling, when it finally arrived, did not use the word victory. The compact did not believe in victory. It was not the kind of institution built for triumphant language. Its formal assessment used a different phrase, one that would be translated imperfectly into humanity's languages, but which meant, roughly, integrity confirmed under conditions exceeding calibrated tolerance. It was the driest possible way to say that humanity had not simply passed the test. It had broken the instrument built to measure it. Humanity became the 413th species admitted to the compact 6 months later, in a ceremony that Earth's governments treated with the gravity of a planetary holiday, and that the compact itself treated, characteristically, as a modest procedural footnote. But something changed in the Crucible after that. The compact quietly revised its testing protocols within the following decade, adjusting the calibration of every future trial to account for what their 412 prior case studies had never told them. That a civilization's strength was not measured only by what it had, but by what it had already learned to do without, and that species born into comfort would always be more fragile under pressure than species who had never known anything else. It was not a flattering revision to make. Several older compact members objected, quietly, to rewriting 412 trials worth of institutional wisdom because of a single outlier, but the number stopped being an outlier soon enough. 2 more species passed their trials in the following decade under the revised standard, and compact historians, centuries later, would trace the shift in their entire testing philosophy back to a recording of a tired man on a dying moon talking about water. Ade Okonkwo never held political office. He returned when the trial ended, to the same disaster relief work he had done before the stars had ever taken an interest in him, because that, he said later in the handful of interviews he ever agreed to give, was the whole point. The compact had wanted to know if humanity could be trusted with the galaxy. He had never once, in 118 days of scarcity and fear and quiet, relentless generosity, been trying to answer that question. He had simply been doing what his people had always done, what they had learned in floods and famines and wars long before any orbital wheel of black alloy had ever taken notice. He had been getting everyone through the night. The galaxy, it turned out, had plenty of species who had never needed to learn that particular skill. It had far fewer who had learned it so thoroughly that they no longer thought of it as a skill at all. They thought of it as simply what you did when the lights went out and the air ran thin, and the only thing standing between you and the dark was the person standing next to you, reaching out a hand, asking what you needed and meaning it. That, in the end, was the whole of the test humanity had actually passed. Not whether it could survive scarcity. Every species in that black alloy wheel had, at some point in its history, survived scarcity. The real question, the one the Compact had spent 412 trials slowly learning to ask, was whether a species remembered what it had learned once the crisis passed, whether it carried that hard-won arithmetic of sharing forward into the abundance that came after, or whether it simply forgot, the way so many comfortable civilizations eventually did, and waited for the next crisis to teach the lesson all over again. Humanity, for all its long and complicated and often ugly history, had one advantage that no amount of compact technology could replicate. It had never been allowed the luxury of forgetting. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, 412 species who had never needed that particular kind of memory were about to learn, slowly and with no small amount of surprise, exactly what it meant to stand beside a species that did. In the decades that followed, humanity's ships joined compact expeditions to the edges of charted space, and something began to happen that none of the older species had quite predicted. Wherever a compact colony faced true crisis, a failed reactor, a collapsed harvest, a plague moving faster than any medical convoy could outrun, human crews were among the first to volunteer, not because Earth's governments ordered it, and not for glory, but because enough of humanity's citizens had grown up hearing the story of a tired man on a dying moon, and had absorbed, without ever needing to be taught formally, the same plain arithmetic he had once spoken aloud to a stranger. Give what you can, trust that it comes back around. Get everyone through the night. Other species began to study this pattern the way the Compact once studied the crucible itself, trying to isolate what exactly had produced it, whether it could be taught, whether it could be replicated in a civilization that had never needed to learn it the hard way. Some concluded it could not be manufactured, only inherited, passed from a species' harshest years into its gentlest ones, carried forward like a scar that had healed into something useful. Others held out hope that any civilization could learn it eventually, given enough honest hardship and enough people willing to stand at the boundary line with water in their hands instead of a weapon. Both were right in their own way. The lesson was never the scarcity itself. It was what a person chose to do with the little that was left, and whether they remembered that choice long after the danger had passed. That, more than any monument or any number carved into stone, was what humanity carried with it into the wider galaxy, not proof that it had earned its place among the stars, but a quiet, stubborn insistence on making sure no one else ever again had to face the dark completely alone.